Welcome back to Reel It In. My name is Joe Messina, and we are coming back with our guest, Mr. Webb, as he is known, because we enjoyed having him so much the first time, and we felt like the conversation was not complete. So he's back with us, and I will let my compadres introduce themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm Dan Sapin. The guy talking behind me who should be talking in front of me is Martin. Go ahead, Martin.
No, you go, man. You go.
That's Martin Hallberg, my buddy in Sweden. I'm Dan Sapin. I'm a psychologist in New York. I'm here with my dear old friend, Dr. Webb Garrison. I'm very happy to have back.
Very happy to be here. Was I supposed to say something else?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mr. Webb. I like that. I like that introduction.
Mr. Webb.
Yeah,
Sound like a
Mr. Webb.
mystical.
it's like
what's he
Slash
called?
or a share.
Matrix Anderson.
right.
Huh?
Anderson.
So Mr.
Love it.
Webb has agreed to walk us through some ideas and topics around the intersection of what did we say, like science and spirituality.
Mhm.
I remember us ending the last episode on a spiral kind of image. So that's quite
Yeah.
interesting. That could be an idea to go back and forth into these different discourses or modes of thought, or however one would conceive of them. And yeah, last time around we had a very, very deep and rich conversation. I also remember us talking about consciousness being, trying to visualize it or somehow talking about it in shapes and forms. And was it a tunnel or I can't remember. But where do
Tunnel.
we jump off today? Yeah,
It was a
Oh, yeah.
spiral.
was it the
It was-
spiral?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Martin, when you had asked what was that main theme we left off on. And we got more and more into spirals, which is an image I love just for me, the most basic meaning of, for me, just sort of being able to circle around the same perception, the same phenomenon, but from a higher perspective each time. You know, the idea that somehow there's something circular to our ideas and our experience, but we gain in perspective each time. So you picture the upward moving spiral and the downward moving as we come to a closer scope with things.
Yeah.
That's what I was left with.
That's a good
Yeah.
good wrap up. Or and also how it could go both upwards and downwards. I mean, it could be a matter of focus, like you said, from a micro perspective to a higher, but it could also be a direction in terms of, libidinal drive or going out towards something or closing in. Because I remember Joe talking about this Japanese comic or something where the husband was kind of, or one of the two was very much into getting to know everything, like obsessed with ideas almost to the point where it ruined things for him. And his wife was afraid to touch the spiral or something like that.
Yeah. So they, like, one by one, sort of this whole town became obsessed with spirals. And it was revealed that it was some kind of force that was overtaking them, and it was like the husband became obsessed, like like an addiction almost to spirals. And then once they lost him, the wife became like just deeply averse to them and was obsessed with like getting rid of spirals. And eventually the whole town just becomes spiraled, basically. And it's a very, I read another one of his series, and it's all very like absurdist and dark, also kind of funny and cool. But Junji
Why
Ito
spirals
in general?
overall? Yeah.
Well, I look.
It's
I
about-
mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I had mentioned, one of the ways that I think of spirals really is as representing a dialectic also. They can be, if you think about what a spiral does, just in its motion, whether outward and inward, it kind of returns to the same point, but at a slightly different relationship from that point. And and as it's either expanding inward or outward, there are extremes. So the whole thing with dialectic is that you have a thesis or an idea, then you have the antithesis, the opposite of the idea, and the synthesis. And so in a way, the motion of the spiral is the synthesis itself. The spiral, just like yin and yang, you see yin and yang when people get it tattooed on themselves, and it's a static object, but in reality, it's a dynamic, moving symbol. It's not a static symbol, and so in a way, a spiral represents the polarities as well as the integration of the polarities. That's one way of that's one way that I understand it. And then I think of Yeats, the widening of the
widening gyre.
The gyre, yeah. And that's all about, the center not holding and kind of us being us losing our center almost as a species, or the center of consciousness in a way.
Yeah. Well, Yeats was, to the best of my knowledge, very concerned with, among other things, World War I. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. I'm sorry, folks. What is this dark beast? Its hour come round at last. I forget the next line. Slouching toward Bethlehem to be born. Mm-hmm. And so you have the idea, which works equally well for a good or a bad outcome, new visitor. For him, it was something destructive, kind of the Antichrist was, I think, one of the images that he was struggling with. But one of the, sorry, folks, one of the reasons that gyre and its widening nature is important, I think, for us, and as well as the meaning of a symbol, is that it helps free us from the idea that there is this simply circular relationship, two dimensions, that most of what people consider to be a symbol, we have a couple of us, three of us have a heavy Freudian thing in our background, but most of what we're talking about with respect to Freudian symbols are signs. I mean, this is kind of a Psych 101 topic, the difference between, or linguistic anyway, the difference between an image, the thing you would call the symbol or the sign, simply being a stand-in. It's like you see the red hexagon at the end of the street. It may say stop on it. We know it's a sign. It's not meant to be interpreted. But most of the things we call symbols are really nothing but placeholders. For Jung, who is a big deal for me, as I think we've made abundantly clear, as well as, we talk about spirals, the idea of an ascending perspective, that you go around the same point, but growing in meaning, growing in insight. You have the function of a symbol to point towards something you don't have yet, an understanding that's sort of on the way. There's a piece for Jung's also the transcendent function, the idea that if you have a problem, there's a natural tendency to work that dialectic, to approach a solution by going to something as yet unknown. A third, other Freudians, post-Freudians, intersubjectivists, people we've talked about, also talked about the analytic third, the idea that there is the analyst, there is the patient, the analysand, and then there is this indescribable creature, which is kind of not a hybrid, but the combination of the analyst and the patient together and the presence of that dyad in the room is a third person in there. So the idea of the third, the thing,
it's a third awareness, a third awareness, whether it's a third person or third awareness or third form of consciousness. I mean, that becomes a semantic question, but so I just thought I would throw that out there, whether we're personifying that as a person or whether that third is simply kind of frequencies of consciousness that constellate in a certain way, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point.
Still sentient, you know.
Yeah. Something important about this, though, which I think gets to the heart of what this means in psychology, is yes, we do use ideas of the third, as if they were real, as if, because in order to talk about their function, it pays to talk about the analytic third as if there was some hybrid, some third person that's a combination of the two participants. But in a way, I know one of the things that Thomas Ogden talks about regarding the analytic third was that combination, the chimera in a way, of analyst and analysand has a different subjectivity than either the patient or the analyst himself. That the coming together of two unconsciouses, both of which are mysterious and neither of which can predict what the other is going to say or want, makes it as though it were a whole separate person, a whole separate source of mystery. So we have kind of an in-between. And I think this connects us to the question of spirituality in science as well. What is this invisible person? Why bother talking about it in those terms? If science is so good, so complete, then why bother with a mystical, indemonstrable phenomenon like that?
Well, right. Well, look, science is not, I mean, just to repeat back what you said and to spin it a little bit, in terms of science being good and complete, science and spirituality or religion both have perpetrated the same errors of logic. They both made assumptions in realms that it's not safe to make assumptions. So, so the reality is that both science and spirituality and religion faces mystery or uncertainty. Okay. Just this morning, I was reading an article that a new study was done on plants, and I need to read this more carefully because I was waking up and it was kind of my morning grog. But it's the first study that shows that genetic mutation appears not to be random. The assumption, scientifically, from the beginning of an awareness of mutation happening, the assumption has been that it is random. This study showed that there was a specific aspect of the plant that was mutating in a non-random way. It was protecting certain aspects of its genome as it mutated, which implies that it is non-random mutation. So that's an example of a scientific assumption that has pervaded. So everyone's assuming, well, mutation is random, and it has been accepted almost as a scientific fact. When if you actually do the science properly, you cannot make that assumption that mutation is random. Now there is actually evidence that mutation is not random. So that flies in the face of what has largely been assumed by most people about genetics since, for the last 150 years or 100 years or, however long, they've been looking into this stuff, the original eugenics studies or whatever. So anyway, and spirituality in the same way can make assumptions. I think last time we started talking about dogma. I am an anti-dogma person. Okay, spirituality and religion can also presume to know what cannot be known, and so one of the things I know for myself as a practitioner, as a sentient being, as a spiritual person, and as a scientist, one of the things that's been very important for me throughout the years has to try to maintain as clean an awareness of what I know and what I'm assuming, or what I can know and what I have to be assuming, where the bounds of knowledge are. Okay, that is one of the things that I think is actually a really critical element for both spirituality and science. Neither this whole argument, and now this argument thankfully is hackneyed and people aren't relying on it as much, but it's kind of like, well, if there's a God, prove it to me. Well, that's not really a scientific perspective. A scientific perspective is not so much, you need to prove it to me. A scientific perspective now is more like we can rule things out. We can gather evidence, but also we have to be able to rule things out. So, So again, this also points to this kind of fundamental mystery, this fundamental ambiguity that we face. And again, it's been very important for me as a person, as a psychologist, as a spiritual person, to know what I know and what I'm assuming, and where the differences are there.
Absolutely. And there is a key point that the false certainty of too many people who think they're being scientific or rational is also reflected in how the same people who like to invoke Occam's razor, that really you don't need all of these spirits. Excuse me, you don't need an unseen power, you don't need an ether permeating the cosmos in order. Well, Occam's razor is usually spoken of as being the simplest argument, is probably the true one, or the simplest explanation. What Occam actually said boils down more accurately to the simplest explanation that accounts for all the data. And science shoots itself in the foot, personifying science and overgeneralizing, but that positivist mentality that scoffs at the idea that there is an unseen force, an unseen variable, is taking it oddly on faith that whatever we're not seeing must therefore not be there. Mm-hmm. In which case it relies upon a selective avoidance of a bunch of data. Mm-hmm. So there's an awful lot of experience and conceptual and semantic reason. They're phenomena. People have experiences and they deserve to be noted and thought about just as any other data. The experience of thousands of years of sentient sapient people is good enough indication that there's something there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at least that there's some importance to the spiritual realm or zone of thought. Like it's not something to be written off when it seems to be a pretty important part of human society. And I think that our society, as much as we think we're science driven, I might argue that a little bit, but it's there is like a sort of rejection of something. There's been sort of a rejection of this, like the like spirit realm, and religion seems to be either just sort of cultural motions people go through, or like a dogma, like we talked about. And that's an interesting weird thing that's happened.
Martin, what's going through your head? I can almost hear the pulsing energies.
I don't know, a lot of different things. But yeah, I think I agree with what I hear here being said in terms of something being avoided or repressed in a way. If one takes it, let's say the scientific discourse, it's also visible in the relationship to things like nature as a concept, where nature being there for man to understand, explore, and extravagate and build stuff on, and propel our technologies on. So there would be a certain rejection or avoidance of a certain fragility, maybe vulnerability, certain things in the human condition that I believe the scientific discourse kind of represent the rejection of that, let's say, finality and vulnerability that comes with the human life. On the other hand, then the more kind of strongly knitted spiritual domain or religious domain would, I guess, do an inverse kind of proposition where nature is mother nature, she's alive, she's imbued with certain qualities that I can get to know as a part of a member in this religious community, and she speaks to me, and there's an inverse kind of so if the scientific discourse would be rejecting kind of their vulnerability, I guess the religious discourse would in a way be projecting their aggression or their active agency in a way. So I think that there's something playing out there that one can see also now in terms of COVID and different things in our everyday life, how these two camps kind of become more and more engaged in like othering each other, and painting the other as a complete idiot. So that's what I was thinking. And I was also thinking something in terms of this analytic third and the integration of opposites that Webb spoke about when we discussed the spiral, that there is a the third position is inherently held in the spinal or in the yin yang movement. So I was thinking there in terms of how this third position would be acknowledged or understood in what we're talking about now. If science is extrapolated on one end, something religious on the other, where is that third element? And I guess that's what we're kind of exploring today.
Maybe it's
yeah.
maybe it's an embodiment.
Yeah, I think that's.
I mean,
good,
like you know, like just I mean, as a I don't mean to be glib or quick to answer that, but it might ultimately have to do with being anchored in lived experience and direct subjective lived experience, and living in the tension between the subjective and the objective, kind of.
The between. Can I take a stab at this? Because okay.
Yeah, the role of the body there is crucial, I think, and yeah, I agree. I like that intuitive hunch, Webb. I'll go with that embodiment, whatever we land up on there. But I'll shut up now.
Look at, don't shut up, Martin. That would be such a waste. I've been back on a Friedrich Nietzsche kick lately for reasons I'm not sure about yet. But I think somebody brought up Zarathustra recently, and it brought me back to college. That's my college philosophy thesis. It was built around the idea that round about the time of Kierkegaard and then Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, philosophers started to reflect a certain depression, a certain almost mourning of something lost in the spiritual life, that the intellect and science were unsatisfying. They don't foster hope. They don't support anything that even approaches a wish for a better life or a transcendent knowledge that makes things better. And so God, the ultimate unknowable, became this source of fear and trembling. First, it was the rejection of authority and the rejection of expertise. That for Kierkegaard, forget the church. And there's relevance here to the anti-science, anti-elite, anti-government forces operating during this, really magnified during this pandemic. You have Zarathustra as this spokesperson for, you have to remember, Nietzsche was basically broke, powerless, jobless, and living in his sister's attic, cold and starting to suffer from syphilis, apparently, when he was starting to write Zarathustra, and things were already on their way in the will to power. And so in the will to power, you have the notion that people are essentially driven by the desire for some kind of mastery, some way to get a foothold in this earth where we have some of the divine oomph ourselves. But what do we end up doing? We project that power into the sky in the form of God, but a particular version of God, not a God that would be recognized as such by any of the polytheistic or even earlier monotheistic cultures, rather a God who is terrifying, a God who doesn't explain himself, a God who has ways and means and laws that he can change at any moment. And so we then become subjugated to the very projection that we put out there because we felt powerless. And so we located the power out there. So what does Zarathustra do? Zarathustra is the Ubermensch. or rather is Zarathustra saying we need the Ubermensch. Pretty much he was the Ubermensch, the man who is going to overcome the weak, halfway there notions of previous iterations of society. You know, when he says God is dead, it's not the last thing he says. He follows that up with essentially, now let's see what new gods are going to be created. And so you take that into the 20th century and you get Sartre and Camus and Kafka. Boy, were those guys depressing. They were depressed. God, there is no God. There is no fundamental meaning to anything in life or the universe. There's a grieving going on. And something that brought it up was I was watching, if anybody has seen the movie Melancholia, I mentioned that to you, Martin. Have you seen that, Webb? Mm-hmm. I think it's something that would be a kick to all watch it together. Next time we have 3 hours to share a screen. Kirsten Dunst plays this very depressed young woman who's getting married, really doesn't want to. She's probably bipolar, gets psychotic. And at the same time that she's acting out and her rich, insensitive, controlling family is trying to get her to behave, there is a rogue planet that appeared from behind the sun that is heading straight for a flyby with Earth. And it's either going to be the utter destruction of Earth, or it's going to be the most glorious celestial apparition in the history of humanity. And there comes a point in this film in which it becomes increasingly frightening, the apparition of this beautiful blue planet in the sky. And Kirsten Dunst's depressed character becomes peaceful and grounded and unconflicted while everyone else is freaking out. And at one unexpected moment in this film by Lars von Trier, who is not a happy-go-lucky guy, the character says, I know things. And then she, has a few bits of psychic knowledge to prove that she knows truths from, a higher place. And tells her sister, you think that if we die, there are other life forms who at least will carry on the tradition of consciousness? No, I know things. There is no other life out there. It was us, and only for a split second, and then nothing. And it got me thinking that here's another iteration of the notion that in a post-religious dogma world, in which science keeps on failing to come up with things that give us hope, the kind of hope we're looking for anyway, that there is a real depression, a kind of quiet, not so quiet despair on the part of people, civilization on a large scale. And the notion that the authorities tell us what the law is, what the truth is. Scientists don't know crap, right? We're in an era now where people's hunches and common sense guide them, because the dogma that comes from on high, whether it's spiritual, religious, legislative, none of it is to be trusted. Our gods have failed us, and our representatives are phonies. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why this need for a higher position, for a better source, is so important to us.
Well, and unfortunately, I mean, I think what you said is very profound, Dan. And I think that, in terms of the postmodern movement and deconstructionism and kind of the broad, probably, we could probably frame this as a grieving process within humanity. And what you're talking about is humanity being pushed into the depressive stage of grief. What's beyond that is acceptance. And I mean, at least in the grieving process. And to me, like the whole deconstructive movement and the whole existential movement kind of did push to, okay, just don't even bother to look for that objective truth. Like you're not going to find it. But that doesn't have to leave us in the place of despair. Then the deeper call is how then do we consciously and intentionally create meaning? How do we then imbue life as a participant in the creative principle? You know, in the and look, we could even say that this is what Freud was talking about when he talked about eros, right? The erotic principle, or the life giving, or the vitalizing principle, that each of us is tasked with creating our own subjective meaning and developing our own subjective authority. The problem, however, is that the vacuum that was created by the destruction of these previous dogmas of authority has been filled by garbage from the internet that has to do with externalized realities. These are all, look, you know, there's research that indicates that we become more creative after we're bored. Okay, after periods of boredom, that is when we become more creative. How often are we allowed to be bored now? Like really bored. I'm not talking about malaise. I'm not talking about, there's lots of malaise, plenty of malaise being filled with likes and dislikes and
I got boxes of it.
But you know, so that I think is one of the things that is a deeper call on the in terms of the evolution of human consciousness in a broader sense. You know, are we now going to allow the exposing that these authorities no longer carry the sway that they did? You know, are we going to allow that to sink in so that we can each develop our own authority, or are we just going to defer to the next god? You know, my joke in the 80s and 90s were that shopping malls had become the new churches, because on Sundays people no longer went to churches, they then went to shopping malls, you know. And all of the, I mean, like if you look at a shopping mall, it's like a mega church, really, you know. And now, particularly with COVID, people are no longer going to shopping malls. Now it's all, we don't have to leave our house, man. People are talking about, like, this drives me nuts, man. People are talking about investing in real estate in the metaverse. Investing in real estate in the metaverse. Like, really? Really, last time we were talking about how foolish it is to pretend that we own this earth. Now we're going to try to pretend to own something that only exists in some kind of digital constellation form. It is bizarre, man.
Yeah, and you get and you get your host, your sacrament from the the sanctified corn dog at the food court. You know,
right?
That's
right.
Yeah,
so
the sanctified corn dog. I'm going to get in trouble for that.
So this is I think what we're not good at. We're good at developing technologies that we are not prepared to use in wise ways. Okay, so I believe that as a species we're great at developing technology. Our capacity to develop technology outpaces our wisdom. Okay, part of the wisdom that we have not internalized with reference to all of this internet stuff is the fact that it's all empty.
Prometheus, it's empty. The eagle that eats our liver every day is the iPhone.
Right. And the
crime was stealing fire.
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's become a portable Skinner box. That's it. It's just one that we're not living inside. It lives outside of us. So
Joe, where are you at now with all these references and ideas?
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna say this metaverse thing. Like, don't get me started on NFTs and that whole thing.
You're started.
But it's yeah. I mean, it's interesting the way you put it, because that really speaks to I guess like a larger perspective about this thing that I'm seeing a lot of, because I'm online a lot, so like that might be why I'm seeing a lot of this. But like there's a big faction of cryptocurrency people and NFTs and this whole thing, and like there's this real, like, again, dogma about it, and how this is like this is the thing that's taking us into the future. This is like where history is going. And should it? and B, like, yeah, I don't know how much these people have stopped to think like there's nothing actually here. Like you are just looking at a box.
What do you make, though, Joe, of the non-fungible token with respect to the overthrow of a master authority? I mean, I'm hinting at something here. You get rid of the government, get rid of the idea of a regulated, consensual, a consensually valued currency that a government, that a self-appointed central authority has any control over. Everything becomes consensual, to the point where Mike Tyson's new NFT got more news yesterday than a dozen other major economic stories.
Yeah, well, Mike Tyson's an interesting person to bring up with consent, but
Mike's behaved himself for a while now.
Yeah.
As far as we know.
Right.
Yes. Allegedly.
Uh-huh.
I like Mike.
Yeah, I mean, the NFT thing, I think NFTs and cryptocurrency in general, like the idea was to sort of decentralize things. But it seems like, at least, from the information I have, like they've sort of just recreated all the worst parts of capitalism in just this less regulated environment where people are still going to scam the system and just make off with a bunch of money, while people who like really believed that they were getting in on the ground floor of something real end up losing everything. And because of the dogma, like they still find their way to thinking like, oh, well, next time I just need to do it this way and change this, and then so yeah, I don't know. I go back and forth a little bit between whether I'm a big government socialist, or at heart like an anarchist, that I truly want like the end of the state and all of that. My issue is that I do have a lot of issues with state power and with centralized power, but at the same time there's a lot that I want to happen that you might need that centralized power to make happen. And if you deregulate everything and de-state and debank everything into true anarchism, you might just end up with like neo-feudalism, with these libertarian overlords like taking over their own little enclaves, and then you have your own nightmare there. So yeah, like that's the thing. It's like it seems as though anytime we try to do this let's democratize capitalism, it just ends up being capitalism. And there is this very there is this sort of Marxist critique you could make of it, which is that you mentioned the dialectic of the spiral earlier, Webb, and that made me think, because I've been reading about Marx and I'm finally sort of starting to understand what dialectical materialism means. And it's that's the thing, is Marx talked about all of this, that he didn't predict like you'll have a computer and there'll be Bitcoin and stuff, but like this idea of credit and like imaginary capital, and that you'll be controlled by this unseen, unreal, like non-fungible and non-tangible thing. And Marx was a philosopher too, and sort of started to bring things down to earth with this materialist idea. And so yeah, I don't know where I just brought us, but that's
Well,
what I'm thinking.
made me think, Joe, and somebody else please jump in here, that we're talking about currency. And currency is not just money. Currency is anything that is a medium of exchange, power, language as a currency. And the underlying theme I think we've been getting to here has been, well, I'm dating it back to the beginning of existentialism, the fall of the centralized authority of the universe sort of getting deposed, or at least questioned heavily. And now you have a world in which we want to remove the government from sources of knowledge, all sources of authority, whether it be a knowledge base, the presumption of a higher level of reasoning, the presumption of being ordained, with somehow power as a divine representative. All this is thrown in the shitter, and so you have money that is no longer related to any authority.
Taken off the gold,
nothing but the consent.
Taken off the gold standard, just to throw that in around the same, it was taken off the gold standard. I forget exactly when, in the 30s, I think, right. That was like deconstructionism, and I didn't think of this before. I think it was originally taken off in the 30s, and then it was put back on, and then Nixon finally took it off again or something like that. But just, that kind of divided currency from any like really, really tangible asset, let's say, or some tangible standard asset or standardizing asset.
Yeah. So there's no master narrative. There is no master economic principle. There is no trust in a central authority that knows better.
Right. And we haven't developed a capacity to collaborate well enough to operate without creating another form of authority. So,
another capitalism.
Yeah, another capitalism, another religion, another another form of science, whatever it might be,
When the system breaks down, who of the different political philosophies, whose members are going to end up becoming the armed oppressors who give us the rules? It's gonna be a bunch of libertarians. You choose the philosophy that suits your temperament to a certain degree. And if what you want is for the government to get its ass out of your affairs, that's not, you may tell yourself it's based on a higher principle. Ultimately, it's an intolerance of anybody else telling you what you ought to do. And push comes to shove. And this is my problem with anarchism. As with most political philosophies, it's just going to be a vacuum that is filled by the same old shit.
That's my fear.
But isn't this also a little bit how it goes in terms of like historical trajectories and once again, like the repetition is never the same, right? So the repetitive motion is similar, but you always end up at a slightly different spot of the spiral or whatever fractal image we're using. Like there is some kind of development taking place, or development, some kind of change taking place through every repetitive motion through the system or the spiral or whatever we use. So in a way, I guess that through large historical epochs, things have gone like this, right? Things are being built up, then they are being destroyed or taken down, or whatever is the right word, and then something new comes up. So I'd like to go back to this because I think there's some interesting topics that I like the idea of embodiment. I like the idea of materiality, from what Joe spoke of materialism, like materiality in the sense of like anchoring gold to currency, or connecting something, ideas with body, matter with intellectual property, and so on. So I think those are kind of the key elements that I've heard that we've sketched out. So maybe I'll pass it back to you, Webb, in terms of this embodiment. Like, would you like to elaborate a little bit on that concept, whatever it means to you, and in this context of science and spirituality, for example?
Yeah, sure. Well, okay, so embodiment, how can I say this? My experience, okay, so my experience, I'll just talk about my experience, actually. I guess that's the best way to talk about it. My experience, as I have developed through life, when I was a child, I was an unbelievably enthusiastic, hyperactive, you know, very visceral child. You know, like I was a very I would say a very embodied child, as children tend to be. You know, when children are born, you know, that they're born in their bodies. That it's very natural. You know, they're not thinking about let's say a distinction between mind and body or anything like that. You know, what I found is that particularly once I started hitting adolescence, my experience of being embodied kind of fractured in a way. Okay, I guess that's the way. Like looking back, that's kind of the best way to put it. I found that in certain ways, I stayed quite embodied, almost in a dissociated way. So, for example, with sexuality, you know, sexuality is a very powerful physiological for me, you know, for I think most people, for me, it was a very powerful physiological experience and very visceral draw. But in a lot of other areas of my life, I kind of lived the life of the mind, you know, and it was of premium import as I went to high school and as I went to college and as I started graduate school, to develop to develop my mind, to develop my capacity to think, to develop my capacity to reason. And there's a way in which that became dissociative after a period of time. What I found is that the development of my intellect kind of led me to be less aware of my emotions. I disregarded my emotions, you know, more. My emotions were more acted out than actually embodied and lived. And so, I mentioned before I started meditating when I was about 19. I believe that at that point, I recognized that there was kind of this dissociation that I was going through. However, when I first meditated, it was almost like I was doubling down on becoming less embodied, you know, which, you know, I was almost meditating in a way to become like pure consciousness.
Meditation as an anti-materialist gesture.
That's right. This is the whole transcendental meditation thing, right? So meditation is about transcendence. It's about becoming more than human. It's about getting away from being human, getting away from some of those sexual feelings that I felt maybe dominated by excessively, you know, and those kinds of things. And so, you know, and so really just kind of, I would say as a gradual process of, you know, becoming a father, and, you know, kind of having, you know, going through a period of my life where I was drinking too much and, you know, starting to recognize that I was actually out of touch with my body and out of touch with my emotions in ways that led me to feel out of balance. And so my own experience has been really critical to feel connected to my body. You know, instead of living in this kind of intellectual realm, really to be aware of my emotions, to know what's going on with me, you know, and still it's a struggle, you know, like anger. Anger is still an emotion that's very difficult for me. It is, you know, it's an emotion that I tried to renounce when I was meditating. Like, it was like again, 19, naive. You know, there's this view of aggression, like you just shouldn't be aggressive. So I'll just try to transcend anger, you know, and then there are plenty of religious texts that tell you can do that. You know, there are plenty that say, just breathe this much and do this and you'll transcend all your negative emotions. It's fine. Don't worry about it. That's all bypass. So there can be spiritual bypass. There can be psychological bypass. There can be scientific bypass. And I think that all of these areas, you know, become bypass when they ultimately neglect to put the onus on each of us to experience life from our own subjective perspective, including our sensations, our perceptions, our emotions, all of the different aspects that make us human and make us real, you know.
Now, in this world of the, as you say, in touch with our own Well, this is also the era of special attention to intersubjectivity and
Yes.
the
Oh, yes,
body.
of
As a
course.
matter of fact, you look at Jessica Benjamin, among others, the body, Joyce McDougall, other important people in this area, look at both the intersubjective world and the body, the flesh, the notion that the body is the unconscious, or
Well, sure.
vice versa. So how do you work that now? Now that the intersubjective and the boundaries between individuals has become seriously relativized, at the very least, what do we do to get out of this one person notion of meditation, myself as the window into being?
I mean, I think that's a good question, but it's probably difficult to answer that question simply intellectually in some senses. I don't mean for that to be a cop out, but so when I'm working with people, okay, one of the ways that I pay attention to countertransference, or what's going on in the room, is by paying attention to my somatic experience, and also what I call parasomatic experiences. Last time I talked about feeling energy. My parasomatic experiences, as I said before, they're reliable. I don't understand them, but they're reliable. When I can feel sensations around another person's body, that is a form of attunement to this relational field. Or it's almost like, we have this intersecting. We each have this field, and when we're together, we have our fields kind of intersecting, and we're holding each other in these fields of consciousness that are then not exactly merged together. It's like, it's not a full merger. It's again, it's kind of a third.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I think
so
bodies do speak in a way, right? They communicate, yet be that language is not the vehicle they use, right?
Yes.
Per definition, and I think, having a small kid on my own, he's 2 now, I think in those terms. It's so natural. I mean, the amount of hours you spend cuddling, he's sleeping in our bed, he comes to the world through hearing the heartbeat of his mom. Like, there's all these registers within us that instantly and pre-linguistically decodes and reacts to another person's body language, posture, breathing patterns, maybe more than anything, eye contact, small winks, and so you take in that somehow and make a prediction, or you come up with some kind of model of where you think you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start speaking. And from my own experience in therapy, I think that third, the Ogden third, it very much relates to that body experience of something becomes bigger than just the two of us when we feel that we're in sync with that kind of bodily experience. It could even be moments of silence where that third position emerges, and that third position also enable us both as a dyad to look at that from the outside. Like, we could both kind of extrapolate ourselves and talk together about us as a team or as an analytic dyad, right? So that becomes possible from this third state, that you both can reflect upon that commonality or that shared space, and go back and forth. Kind of, you can go into something and let's say you have an argument with your therapist. You could say, okay, I'm now angry at you because of this and that. But you could also then shift and say, look at what just happened, right? Like, the two of us were arguing about this, and you do that from a third position in a way. So my intuition says that the body is crucial to these aspects, and I'm wondering what the kind of homologue could be in a more like group level, or we talk about society and politics, like that material.
A body politic. Why do we use that language?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's probably a lot of people who have, I guess. I don't know. But I mean, I'm thinking of like Foucault and some of those people. They spoke a lot about the body as a kind of tattoo of what a person has lived through, right? Like the injuries or the injustices of society is carried by every person's body in a way, right? Like, it leaves its traces there. Like, the body keeps the score, right? That's another one of those trauma Bassel van der Kolk book that we spoke about on some episode, that the body is registered all that we have lived through in a way. But yeah, I don't know if there are other good associations to that body politic. Like what would be the body to build on, so to speak, in a
Well,
broader.
it's tricky. It's tricky also, I think, because it has to do with awareness. Like, a lot of what you're talking about, Martin, had to do with dyad. And, when I'm doing therapy, with a single person, I'm, again, to get into the zone, like I now move in, and I think probably a lot of us do this. We move into a certain form of receptivity, a certain form of consciousness where we are receptive in a way that we would not necessarily normally be in, if we're driving to work or if we're going to the grocery store, like those kinds of things. Okay. Now, if I'm teaching a class, and particularly if I'm doing a meditative exercise with a class, I also can open those channels and feel like I can close my eyes when I'm doing a group meditation, and I can feel in the room who is deep into meditation, who is anxious in the room. Like I can feel different, I can feel this stuff. Now, so again, this is something that I've done enough to the point that I've paid attention. And when I was out in New Mexico doing a lot of these types of exercises, this sense developed much more clearly and much more reliably. Now, how does that translate to what you're talking about with the collective? That becomes a huge area of ambiguity, because what it points to is that we can be injured in ways that we're not even aware of. We can be affected in ways that we're not even aware of. We can be, that if we are connected to this collective, which I presume that we are, we can have a dream or an experience that we may completely misinterpret because our frame of reference is so, let's say, egocentric, or so, so focused on, well, what was that about me? Instead of what was that about the collective, like these kinds of things. I think that becomes very tricky. I think it becomes very, very tricky to know how even to decipher this stuff. So then the question is, how do we develop an anchor point? How do we develop a way of anchoring this, let's say the body politic? How can we, and I think that, I think the culture is trying to do this in different ways, but I mean, or at least American culture is trying to do this in different ways. Talking about critical race theory, like that's the big thing now, or that over the last year or year and a half, critical race theory has been the big thing. Do we talk with our young kids about, the fact that we have a racist history as Americans? Or do we act like, if we talk about our kids, that somehow we're going to induce guilt in them and they just can't tolerate it as children? I mean, this is a huge area that is being talked about in different school boards across the country. Different laws are being passed about banning critical race theory. That, I think, is an example of not only an area where people have literally historically been traumatized, and there are literally groups who continue to carry the marks of that trauma intergenerationally. Okay, but now it's like, well, can we even engage this in a way that allows us to heal this as a culture in some kind of way?
Look at the parallel, and look at, to me, this is proof of concept on so many levels. We shift the discussion to the body, and at the same time we shift it to the collective and the challenge, the huge dilemma, trilemma, quadrilemma of finding a language, finding some sort of a currency that enables people to engage over, on the one hand, the body, the most, it is our corporeality. It is our locus where I am here. Okay. I can say, I love you, man, or I care about everyone, but there is no demonstrating this except through action that can be that can be witnessed through the senses, the perceptions of other people. And yet, what else have we been talking about here? What do we do about the body? The body is the single greatest locus of repression, of the nexus of desire and shame and sin and procreation and murder, destruction, rape. It is the ground zero of all kinds of trauma as well as transcendence. So on the one hand, you have the problem of talking about what is it that binds people. I mean, Jung is essential, okay, the collective unconscious, but the concept does nothing for people who still need a currency. They need to see, where is the bolt of lightning? Where's the thread that connects me to a billion other people? Can't show me? Well, then it's bullshit. But look at what happens with the body and critical race theory. To me, critical race theory is the closest thing to an accurate representation of the history of racism and other nasty isms. And yet you don't simply have people debating its validity or debating points within it. You have people becoming enraged that the denial that people are now treating critical race theory as if it were sodomy, or the way sodomy used to be thought of. You know, it's got some real advantages, frankly. I mean, critical race theory and sodomy, that's not where I want to go right now. The point is, why would a collection of ideas that reflect what is to me a self-evident fact of history be the source of so much rage and repression and denial, as if it were a form of original sin? What is it where this is the body politic and its repressions, as opposed to the body corporeal?
Yeah, well, I mean, in this case, at least, like, people are being told that it is a lot of things that it isn't, and that, you know, it's, you know, it's also like a legal theory that's like more of a, you know, postgraduate thing that is not being taught in elementary schools. But like, even if it is, like, something influenced by this theory is ends up in an elementary school lesson. Yeah, it's just insanity. It's again this dogmatic, I really latched onto that word, but this dogmatic approach. And yeah, we have this whole thing, you know, we were talking about the dichotomy of science and spirituality before. This isn't so much spirituality, but it's, you know, there's this, these opposing forces of like a misinformation complex in this country versus, you know, I believe in science, which is a little like, I thought of this early on when we were talking about sort of the limitations or like the sort of overreach of science and stuff. And it was like, yeah, I think I understand why people do it, but I don't think science was meant to be something that we go like, I believe science. It's like, well, no, I believe like the rigorous research that's been done in biology, and I believe the conclusions reached by good research in oceanography or whatever. You know, it's like, yeah, like though it's a good thing, but it's also a framework and not a dogma.
Right, a method and a framework, and a method and a framework that a lot of times people overly simplify when they go to interpret results. You know, so usually a result will be stated, you know, like whatever it might be, you know. Okay, so here's an here's an example. A recent study indicated that kids who were exposed to cannabis in utero had a greater likelihood of having attentional problems, some issues with aggression, like these kinds of things. It's a study with a relatively small sample, and it hasn't been replicated, but it's a finding nonetheless. Okay, so one person can read that and say, okay, well, you know, there's a finding from this one study that exposure to cannabis in the womb may contribute to the development of attentional problems, aggression, and anxiety. And another person might read that and say, well, if a child is exposed to cannabis in the uterine in utero, they will become aggressive and anxious, and so then, a lot of times when research is interpreted, it is made to sound more definitive in a way than the research really is. Research is about finding trends, particularly applied research. It's about finding trends. It's not about
how does a trend become dogma? How does a trend become dogma?
Right.
And
well,
why?
Because people are really good at overly simplifying reality, right? I mean, look, we're good at absorbing bullet points. We particularly, talk about emotional stuff, particularly if we're anxious or we're angry. It is really, really easy to overly simplify reality. So I think that we are wired, actually, in some ways, to deny the level of complexity that we actually face in this life.
One way we do that is, what is dogma but a mandatory idea?
Mhm.
Or an idea or word, concept that is treated as though it is concrete, as though it were
It's true. As though it's true.
an undebatable fact, a true fact, and people leap to, we hunger for it. Yes. Because trends are unsatisfying. Right. Trends cannot be grabbed by the body. The body can only grab an object, can only bite real food, can only have sex with something embodied. Mm-hmm. We need something solid. And especially when there is a paucity, a vacuum of trustworthy ideas, especially, you talk about the iPhone, the fact that there is this profusion, the internet, this profusion of half-digested, unvetted notions. Even those of us who go about some kind of scholarship with some degree of sincerity, on the one hand, I couldn't have done my dissertation or the book that came after it if I didn't have access to a lot of material much faster than if I had to go to the stacks of the library. On the other hand, I had to filter out 99 point, how many decimal places percent of the bullshit that kept finding its way onto my screen. After a while, you give up. And people want dogma, among other things, because they can't handle uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It reduces anxiety.
That's true. And right. I think it also goes to, it's also picked up by the machine, I would say, somewhat abstractly, And I think of since I'm studying psychology now, I think of the term of evidence, for example, evidence-based treatment versus non-evidence-based treatments and so on, the whole debate around that. But one point or critique in there is also how the machine gets fed by itself in a way. The studies that are taken out on certain premises becomes easier to evaluate. So they then get more funding for new studies. So there is a whole kind of loop where insurance money and pharma and everything becomes geared to solidify this track of we do studies this way, we conduct therapy based on these manualized treatments, we give recommendations for diagnosis based on this, and this then becomes evaluated. It's not easy for, let's say, hey, I want to evaluate 10-year psychoanalytic processes and see how do you even fit that into the kind of machine that has been built. And I think this goes for many ways of our society, how data is used and how the surfing we do on the internet gets picked up and then served back to us with propositions of what Netflix shows we want to watch, and we do watch them and we do like them. So the whole thing becomes like a self-feeding mechanisms in a way. And that's why I like this idea of a metaphor of grounding yourself in the body, feeling what's going on inside me, using the human elements of perception and registering your own experience. And I like that term of an anchor point that you threw out there, Webb, and whatever that could be in social fabric, I don't know, but perhaps a term like stillness. I read something interesting. I think you'd like this, Dan. It was a Jungian guy, a Swedish guy. I can find his name for you later, but he wrote about the dialectic between, on the one hand, integration. So let's say assimilating, integrating your dreams, your history, your the stories, and trying to mold your own kind of understanding of yourself. But if you take that too far, it would be too egotistical. You would become completely self-absorbed and maybe that's an element of what's going on in society now. But his idea that I haven't really thought about that much was it's equally important to anchor that process of let's say understanding your dreams and as much as you can about yourself and so on with its opposite, namely stillness. Meditating on an ocean or a plane, or I'm not a good meditation practitioner, so I wouldn't know. But I like that idea of like contrasting constructive ego work, if we put it that way, with an opposite, which is basically taking in stillness.
Well, the stillness also keeps us honest. I mean, actually,
exactly.
Because we're really good at creating images that are convenient or that we like to see, or, like we have a lot of self-serving biases. If the stillness allows us to feel, it actually allows us to feel into the authenticity, absolutely. Yeah.
And how, am I right? I actually wanted to ask you about this, Martin, because you've been immersed in the DSM and what we consider to be evidence, the evidence that is most accessible and amenable to group consensus. What kind of evidence is it? And is there any place for the evidence of that still mind regarding its own experience? See, the joke is we turn it around. I believe in practice-based evidence. I don't trust evidence-based practice because I find it to be average at best. It is nothing but that which can be consensually validated by a whole bunch of people who are not paying attention to themselves. Right?
I know that there is, on a general level, I think we studied last week that the interreliability of the DSM is 40%. So it's not very high.
It's
so
awful. It's awful.
4 out of 10 would diagnose the same diagnosis on a patient on average. But that doesn't say that the alternatives are better. But to your question about the stillness, I know there is some kind of newer trends and evidence going for these kind of mindfulness, the ACT acronym, acceptance commitment therapy, which is basically a westernized version of mindfulness. And they do that a lot on a stress diagnosis and people who are facing, those kind of problems, and they have come out quite good. That's the only one I know. But to the evidence of a silent mind in a Western psychiatric language, I think the ACT therapy is big. Over here in Sweden, it's booming. And it's basically for all these people that have to work too hard, so they become stressed and they don't know what to do with themselves. So they get some kind of guidance in accepting themselves. I'm sure they work with the body, with feeling what's going on and allowing yourself to feel whatever's is there, basically. But that's the only one I can come up with. But it's a good question you ask. I think it would be very interesting to look at that. Like, what could stillness actually mean for an individual, for groups of people? How could society be built on ideas that stillness is needed, also in terms of planning and city planning? And, what could stillness look like in a modern, intersubjective, kind of full-on tempo life where stillness would be integrated as a part of living that life? I think it's an interesting question. I'm going to take that with me. I like it.
Yeah, let me give you an addendum to it. Let me just real quickly. What if you, just a little thought experiment. What if you imagined a time in the near future in which the evidence-based research, the research that is geared towards getting the most efficacious treatment approaches, were conducted by people, all of whom were raised and acculturated in a Buddhist mindful way of being? What would the evidence that you were discussing in class be as opposed to what it is now?
Yeah, I think it's a good point.
The other thing in terms of stillness, another way that we could dichotomize this, okay, and I think this may point to why it may be difficult for us even to do this kind of research in Western cultures. We're talking about, we could think of this as a tension between doing and being, right? Doing and being. So if stillness is more being, Western culture, and we can connect this back to capitalism. Capitalism has no tolerance for stillness. If you're still, you're not going to buy anything, right? If you're about being, you don't need the next big thing. That's all about doing. So I think that one of the things, even if you look at the word meditation, okay, like what, and this is a problem, I think, culturally. The word meditation is about thought, like the translation of meditation. If you look at the etymology of contemplation, meditation, any Western word that gets it at what Zen Buddhists would call sitting, they just sit, like, what are you going to do? I'm going to go sit. Okay, fine. I think this is a fundamental obstacle that we face kind of in our collective. Western cultures tend to be very, identified with doing. It's all about doing. It's not about being. Where does being get you? How does that put food on your table? How does that get your investments to go up? In terms of the DSM, one of the things that I also wanted to say, Dan, I don't know if you guys are aware of this. In 2012, right before the DSM-5 was published, it was published in 2013. The same 10 personality disorders have been a part of the DSM, I think, since it was maybe first started. Schizoid was developed in the early 50s, schizotypal in the early 50s. Okay, they talked about eliminating 5 of the personality disorders, and they decided not to. In the process of navigating this, 2 international members of the personality disorder subcommittee walked out saying that the decisions for the DSM were not being made on the basis of empirical evidence, that they were being made on the basis of political considerations. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. That's dogma. Again, it's dogma. What's the difference between schizotypal personality disorder and mild autistic spectrum disorder? I think, some people have investigated that empirically, but I think that that's something that could be investigated a lot more clearly, because are we talking about, is there an overlap? Is there an overlap between schizotypal and autistic spectrum?
Not only is there an overlap, Webb, but do you remember the 3 letters that we used as shorthand for schizotypal? It's an acronym, an insulting one.
No, I don't actually.
The funny looking kid.
Really?
That was, and it wasn't just from one professor. It was a particular Derner professor, and he was channeling, another little psychoanalytic trope that, first of all, think about as a joke, what truth it reflects about the kind of thought process that at very least can infect the discussion of diagnoses, the sort of thing that would make people walk out, which there's more to it. The funny looking kid was meant to be the differential, the variable that enabled us to differentiate between autism and schizotypal, because the schizotypal were weird.
Wow.
And honestly, if you look at the criteria that, and Martin, please correct, I don't know, you're fresher on this, but if you look at the criteria for schizotypal, they all are rather more clinical sounding ways of saying bizarre, strange, nutty, wacky, weird.
Yeah, and I think that
really was solid clinical stuff.
Right, and I think schizotypal was formulated in 1952 or 1956. I mean, it's it was, again, these are like theoretical formulations. These were not, these are like theoretical constructs that were born out of psychoanalytic thought. These were not, I don't think researched adequately, and certainly haven't been subjected to the level of research that needs to be done. Like I said, a little bit of work has been done on this, and it seems like the differential between schizotypal and autistic spectrum has to do with a person's reported subjective sense of self. There's a little bit of a difference, but still, it just raises questions. What people forget, and this is the other thing. If we're honest about what we're doing in science, we're dealing with constructs. We're dealing with invisible realities that we create, and that we either create or discover. It's somewhere between creating and discovering. And we do the same thing in religion. Okay, in religion, we're dealing with constructs: a construct of God, a construct of forgiveness, a construct of love. Now I'm going to go a little far afield, because I know that we're running a little short of time. But one of the things that I've been fascinated with recently, I guess even before the new Matrix movie came out, I was just kind of reflecting on the fact that one of the big areas of debate now has been, are we in a simulated reality, right? Um, uh, and people like Elon Musk are saying that probably we are, because if we've seen this much movement in our lifetime or this much development in our lifetime, it wouldn't take a whole lot more for this all to be a simulated reality. How is that much different from the idea of being on Earth to go to heaven? If heaven is the ultimate reality, this is a simulated reality anyway. So now we're simply repackaging an ancient idea about the fact that we're really living for another world, and we're just repackaging it in kind of contemporary technological terms. So that's just an idea I kind of wanted to throw out there also as we're.
So it's starting to get about
Bakers?
to wrap this up. Joe, what are your thoughts?
I'm just getting warmed up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of speaking to that simulation theory point, it's based on a few assumptions that would have to be true, which is fine to do in like theoretical, or hypothetical, I guess, science and other areas. But like, I watched a video about this recently, made by an anarchist, interestingly enough, that examined it, like what these people were saying, like Musk and other morons. And it was like, yeah, if you actually look into what they're saying, it's like, yeah, if these 7 things are true that we don't know are true, then there is some calculable possibility of that being the case. But also, like you're saying, like it is worth considering, are we just repackaging an old idea? And there's not much reason to really worry about it at all.
How's it different? How's it different from reincarnation?
Yeah.
I have an idea. Namely, isn't it something that after all the scientific advancement, all of the revelations of the last couple of thousand years, the last 50 years, the notion that the universe is a simulated reality that somehow follows the laws of information theory is promulgated by information theorists who essentially do what was always done, namely project the creator of the creation and the creator of the universe as number one, being an entity who is like us, follows similar principles to the ones we're interested in, but is way better at it than us. Mm-hmm. And that there is ultimately a truer world out there, yes, that there's more than just this. And I don't care if you're Elon Musk with countless billions and your own fleet of spaceships, the desire for something more and a big daddy who is kind of your role model. You're aiming to be like that, but he's way bigger and better at it than you. Simulated reality, that's the fucking best you can do. Just a bigger video game? Come on.
Well, right. And that's the counterpoint to embodiment, right? Because if we are truly living embodied lives, this is the source of our data. This is the source of our data, not some hypothetical model of how we could be living in a computer simulation, or that that this could be our 8th time or 300th time in an incarnation because we're in the process of traversing souls. Now, I say that with a full receptivity to the possibility of reincarnation. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows? But these parallels are notable. They're definitely
I think that temporal dislodge that you guys talk about, that everything is supposed to happen after the next corner over there. You will get to paradise, or you will get to the simulated universe, or you will have a nice body after you've bought all these products and exercised on this new bike, and so on. I mean, that's really as really a central problem. And I think, like you said, Webb, the counterpoint to that would be, let's go sit. And I mean, isn't it, who is it? I think Jesus tells one of the other, there's a robber or something. There's like one of the other guys who are being strung up at the same time. I think he's a thief or something, who asks Jesus, like, can you bring me to paradise with you or something? And he says, yes, it's already here, or something like that. Like, yeah. I mean, the idea there being, as I understood it, it's like, no, it's not, you're not going somewhere other, you know, it's already accessible to you, more or less, in terms of in here, I guess, right? So between Elon Musk and that story, I think that story has more more salience to it.
And what is, if you had to sum it up, if you had to sum up something on humanity's tombstone, could be, is this all there is? Because everything is an answer to that question.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's the same damn set of answers, no matter how much better our toys get.
Well,
right.
Our podcast is all there is, so you should subscribe at anchor.fm.
Trust Joe the anarchist, he knows.
It's nice to
what
chat
you need
to you
to know.
again, Webb. Thanks for
great. Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you,
My
Dr.
pleasure.
Garrison.
You got it. My
Martin,
pleasure.
Joe. See you next time.
Great talking with you guys.
See ya.
Thanks for helping us reel it in.